the task before Mountbatten, Nehru, Patel, and VP Menon was to try and get all those states that were going to be within the borders of post-partition India to accede to India. Okay, they were, and they had 3 weeks. Imagine 3 weeks to do it. On the 25th of July, Mountbatten addresses the Chamber of Princes and says, "You sign on the dotted line, or your days are numbered. You know, your subjects will rise up against you. You know, you won't survive." And they were able to do it.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Jaipur Bites at the Samsung Galaxy Tab S9 series Jaipur Literature Festival at the VFS Global Friend of the Festival Lounge. This is Eric Chopra, your host, and I'm here with John Zubrzycki. This is an episode in collaboration with Ithihasology. So John, you have throughout your career been massively interested in histories of South Asia. And you work specifically and mostly with India. So before we go into your body of work and the vast areas that it has managed to traverse, I want to understand your origins, your own history. What brought you to South Asia?
Okay, I was born and grew up in Australia's capital city, which is Canberra. It's a planned city, so planned that there's nothing organic or spontaneous about it. Of course, it's very beautiful, but it's very predictable. And after I finished school, I worked for a year, and then I decided I would travel for a year because I wanted to, discover the exotic, discover the unexpected, discover the adventurous, which Canberra just wasn't. I mean, it was a great place to grow up, but I really wanted to experience something that was quite different. And in those days, and we're talking the sort of late 70s, you could still go overland, so you would fly to Jakarta and island hop Burma. I landed in Calcutta in December 1976, and my first night in India was at the Salvation Army guest house on Sutter Street. And then kept going through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, all the way to Europe. And in those days, on that trip, India was the country that just fascinated me the most. I had with me something called the Murray's Handbook to India, which was first came out in, I think, the 1860s, and I had the 25th edition or something. It was like a gazetteer. There's places in that handbook that are still not in Lonely Planet, and so I used this as my guide. And so I got to these out-of-the-way places and stayed in dak bungalows and circuit houses and PWD bungalows, which was just, as I said, of all those countries I visited, more than a dozen countries on that trip, India was the one that just captured my imagination. And so I went to university. I studied Indian history and Hindi. I had A.L. Basham, who is probably known to people of a certain generation, but his work, The Wonder That Was India, is still one of the classic works on Indian history. And so I was very lucky to have Basham as my lecturer, because I think I was one of his last students, and he died shortly after. So yeah, and the rest is history. That's why I'm here, thanks to Basham and that first trip to India.
And Basham has written The Wonder That Was India, a very thick book, influenced a sea of academics. But you've managed to write the shortest history of India. Yes. It's this thin volume, and I think to myself, how do you basically sandwich and bring this vast tapestry that is Indian history? How do you make it concise, yet you are rooted in its nuance? How did you do it? And what do you include and exclude when you write the shortest history?
That's all a good question. When I remember I was in Mumbai, of course, staying at a friend's house. He was a Parsi, and lovely old gentleman who'd gone to school with Salman Rushdie. From my window, I could see Attila, the Ambani mansion, towering above sort of Kemp's Corner. And I was doing a story on Nirav Modi, the fugitive diamond merchant, who you all would know. Anyway, so this email comes from my publisher in Melbourne. Do you want to write a shortest history of India? And I go, and I really had to take a deep breath, because the challenge of a project like that. He said, you've got 50,000 words. which I think translates into 1,000 words per century or something, if you go from 3000 BC till now. But then I'd studied Indian history. I'd made so many trips to India. I'd lived and worked here, and I thought this is a great opportunity to put all, everything I've read together. Go over it again, revise it, and that was it was daunting. It was really daunting. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Certainly. How do you decide? How much weight do you give to the southern Indian dynasties, the Cholas, the Pandyas, the Pallavas, versus what was happening in North India at that time? It was the Delhi Sultanate or the coming of the Mughals. How do you balance what was going on in the east of India? We had the Ahom kingdom versus what was happening in Punjab. I mean, it's look. You just cannot fit everything into a history like that. But I guess it's chronological, of course, has to be if it's going to be a history. But it was complex. A colleague of mine was writing the history of China at the same time. In China, you had sort of distinct periods, distinct empires, mostly which ruled, bulk of the mainland. In India, aside from the Mauryas, the Guptas, the Mughals, and so on, you had diverse power centers all over the subcontinent. So putting all that together was hard. But it was enjoyable as well. As I said, it was something which gave me the opportunity to revise everything that I'd written and discover new things. Like the Delhi Sultanate was one area that I'd hardly ever read about or touched on. And there you had this incredible cast of characters, of rulers, and so on, and the interaction between them and the rest of India.
Yeah. No, so there is, of course, the question of what do you include and exclude in terms of histories that have occurred. But there is also the question of themes, right? Because there are certain kind of histories that one might expect when one reads, oh, this is the shortest history of India, or this is a concise history of India. So, a lot of themes that we confront or we come across in schools, which are these mainstream narratives of the rise and decline of empires, the formation of states, looking at economy, polity, and society as the major themes is usually what features. But your body of work, apart from the shortest history of India, has also gone into the niches and very specific areas of exploring histories. My most favorite part of John's work is his fascination with the fantastical, one might say, or one that is mesmeric. So he's worked on jaduwalas, magicians. He's worked on jugglers. He's worked on jinn, these entities made of smokeless fire. He has worked on the mysterious Mr. Jacob. So I have a twofold question. One is, of course, what is and maybe this is axiomatic, who isn't fascinated with the fantastical? But what is your fascination with the fantastical? And B, when you write narratives such as these based in South Asia, there is that worry of it being stereotyped as the Oriental other, because this idea of the exotic East, which really comes in with the colonialism with India being colonized, and the first histories being written of, this is a land of snake charmers and this is a land of elephants. How do we break that stereotype? How do we talk about these histories without playing into that trope?
Well, that's a huge question. my fascination with the fantastical, look, especially when you would be traveling around India in the 70s and the 80s. I remember my train was held up in Alipurduar in West Bengal because there was a strike in Assam. This was 1979, I think. And so I think it was like 24 hours. We were sitting there in the station, and I wandered out, and there was a Jadawala, Madari, an Indian magician, performing in the square outside the railway station. He did the basket trick, where a little boy climbs into a basket barely big enough to fit him, and the magician just starts stabbing the basket with this sword. And the boy's screaming when he lifts the sword out. That's covered in blood, and the onlookers are just horrified. And the final act of this trick is where he lifts the boy up out of the basket with the sword. It was like a very large knife through his neck, and lifts the boy up and basically shows the boy. And to me, this was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen, because to me, I could not see that it doesn't seem like there was any possibility of any trickery involved. There was no brace. This knife went through the boy's neck. So that was I guess my introduction to Indian magic. And then when I was writing the Mysterious Mr. Jacob, which is about Alexander Jacob, who had a curio shop in Shimla. He was a man of mysterious origins. He occupied that liminal space between East and West. He was a diamond trader. He was a merchant. He traded in secrets. He was a spy. And he was also the inspiration for Lurgan Sahib in Kipling's Kim, if any of you have read it. But it was the magic that he did, inviting people to his drawing room, getting a walking stick and making a grapevine grow out of it, and giving his guests fresh grapes that had magically appeared from this walking stick. That got me interested in magic. But what particularly fascinated me, and still does, is this intersection between East and West. How did Indian magic influence Western magic, and vice versa? Why were Indian magicians donning top hats and tuxedos and going to the West and calling themselves Professor Alvaro or Professor this or whatever, and performing Western magic on the Western stage despite being Indian? And why were Western magicians donning turbans and sherwanis and calling themselves the fakir of Shimla, the fakir of Jaipur? There was a fakir of Jaipur, there was a fakir of Ulu, and bringing Indian magic to Western audiences. So Houdini first performed at the Columbia exhibition in Chicago in 1891, I think it was. Dressed as an Indian fakir, before he started doing his handcuff tricks and whatever. As soon as Houdini started doing those handcuff tricks, Indian magicians in India were doing it, and even better than he was. So, this fascinating intersection between East and West is what I wanted to bring out in that book. And as you said, going back to this exoticization of India, for a lot of people, their first encounter with India would be at some of these world fairs that were held. You think of Crystal Palace 1851, and then they would be just all over the place. In 1900, Motilal Nehru, the patriarch of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, decided he would become India's P.T. Barnum and take a troupe of jugglers to the Paris Exposition. It's a long story, he nearly didn't get them there, but 60 million people went through the turnstiles of the Paris Exposition in 1900. 60 million. Even if half of them had gone to see Nehru's jugglers doing sword-swallowing tricks and, basket tricks, and the rope trick wasn't quite invented then, but, there would be a curry house, there would be elephants, there would be a chai store, there would be people, making handicrafts and all of that. So that was that encounter. But there was a dark side of it too, because you had a lot of exploitation. And we were talking about the Oriental troupe that was sent to England, and they brought with them their cobras. It was so cold the cobras froze, so they had to bribe Lascars to bring more cobras to them. But basically, they most of these troops, not Nehru's, but most of these troops just ended up on the streets because the people who brought them over just dumped them. And there was a lot of exploitation. There was a very dark side to that trade in entertainment in the 19th century.
Now, I think in this area, as you rightly highlight, there is an intersection of the East and the West that we sometimes perhaps avoid, because there is a constant conversation on post-colonialism and the influence that the West has left behind in colonized countries. But one is not able to perhaps recognize this, what one may call the express that took this idea of magic and spiritualism and all of these ideas that we have. So many documentaries are now becoming popular. And I think your work is also important in this area because, as he mentions, the Oriental troupe that goes there and that mistreated, John highlights that. And it makes you realize that these people, including, when the Colonial India exhibition happens in 1886, you have Indians taken from jails. And this one man called Tulsi Ram, a very fascinating story of Tulsi Ram, who goes there. And these are people who are, some of them are villagers, some of them are agriculturists, but they are museumized in the Colonial India exhibition. They're placed there as museum objects, and they're said sweet maker from Agra. He is not a sweet maker from Agra. He is Tulsi Ram, who's come there to meet the Queen. So we have that, but I think your work is able to highlight that quite well.
Yeah, it really does, and there's a lot of information. It's a really interesting area actually, because there was a lot of exploitation. I mean, you think of Indian indentured labourers being sent to places like Mauritius and Africa and so on to build railways or cut sugarcane. But there was this huge trade, human trade, and you'd go to the Paris exhibition. There'd be Australian Aboriginals, Eskimos from Alaska, pygmies from Africa, and it was like a human zoo. Yeah, and there was in Berlin. And, there was a trade. There was a guy called Hagenbeck. He was a German, but based in what was then Ceylon. He traded not just in humans but also in animals. So he would source the tigers and the elephants and the other exotic animals that were part of these expositions, or he would sell to circuses. And circuses often had performers from India in them doing acrobatics or tightrope tricks and things like that. So it was. I mean, it was a very globalized world then. This entertainment industry was incredibly globalized, and there were well-defined trade routes, very sophisticated networks of exchange and exploitation.
Now, see, from the shortest history of India to Jaduwalas, jugglers, and jinn, to also royalty. That's another area that you've explored. And before we go to your latest book, on which I want you to talk about what brought you to write the story of the princely states in Dethroned, I want to talk about, we're at the Jaipur Literature Festival, so, the Royal House of Jaipur. And you talk about this being the most glamorous family that you have encountered. So, A, what was the story that made you want to write this? And B, was there any moment while writing the book that you thought to yourself, oh, this has to be the most interesting anecdote, any experience that you want to share?
There were so many. Look, again, it was a publisher that approached me, Juggernaut, to write this book on the House of Jaipur, which to me is India's answer to the crown. Okay, it is an incredible story that brings into it just this vast range of characters. I was just staggered because, I mean, here we are in Jaipur. Okay, everyone's heard of Gayatri Devi. Yes, everyone's heard of Gayatri Devi, of course. Considered one of the world's most beautiful women. She was the third wife of Sawai Man Singh, of Jai Singh, who was the Maharaja of Jaipur until he died while playing polo in 1970. Oh gosh, it was a thrilling book to write, because I just kept finding I say skeletons tumbling out of almirahs, all this very saucy stuff that is not, I don't want to exoticize it, but Jai was an extremely promiscuous man, and even while he was courting Gayatri Devi, he was having an affair. I guess he already had two wives with Virginia Sherrill. There's many anecdotes to the story that are in this story, but anyone seen City Lights, Charlie Chaplin's movie? The last scene has got the blind flower girl in it. That was an actress called Virginia Sherrill. She fell in love with Jai. He brought her here. She was at first fascinated and then rather sort of repulsed by it. She said at one point, I thought that purdah was something that you ate. But that was, her encounter with Jai's first wife, second wife, Jo, who she became very close with, and that they were constantly traveling, meeting up in Biarritz or Cannes or some spa in Switzerland, and having this very public affair, while Jai was busy wooing Gayatri Devi. So it's that was one thing. I guess the other scoop in the book was Gayatri Devi. She was one of, I think, was 5 children. She had the official version of the story. I mean, okay. So Gayatri Devi wrote her autobiography, A Princess Remembers, which people take as being, quite literally true, but there's a lot that's omitted, and my aim was to try and fill the gaps of the story that she did not want to have made public. One of which was the fact that a girl that people referred to as Baby, that was her nickname, as her adopted sister. In fact, that was her half-sister. Her mother, Indira Devi, another extraordinary character from Kuch Behar, had an affair with a Hyderabadi nobleman, and this and Baby was the product of that affair. And I finally got somebody in the royal family to admit to it. I also met Khusru Jung's son Ali in Hyderabad, who spoke openly about it. It was one of those things that you mention in Jaipur, and people just did not want to comment on it. They did not want to. It was a bit shameful, but it was. Yeah, but anyway, look, there was just so much to this book. I was fortunate enough to get access to all 3 sides of the 3 branches of the family, but it was still, yeah.
No, that's fascinating, and it only reveals to me that your process of research is intensive in a way that it is not only looking at primary and secondary sources. You are constantly involved in going through the archives, yes, but there's interviews, there's traveling, there's being in space, locating yourself in geography. Which brings me to another daunting task, which I believe is writing a story like Dethroned, because it would require you to scour through many, many pages of history and tell a very complicated story that the consequences of which we still see. It's all around us. So tell us about Dethroned.
Okay, Dethroned is about what happened to the 562 princely states that were within the boundaries of British India at the time of independence. You had the giants like Kashmir and Hyderabad. Hyderabad, having an economy equivalent to that of Belgium, 220,000 square kilometers, to, I think, Bilbari, a tiny little microstate in Gujarat. I would guess that the total land area was probably about equivalent to the Clark's hotel grounds, and the population was actually less than the number of people sitting in this room. Okay, so you had 16 million people in Hyderabad, richest, strategically most important state, down to these little micro-states mostly in Gujarat. So it was a daunting task, of course, to try and tell the story of what happened to these states. But in a nutshell, where to start? Look, I can talk about how they were arranged in gun salute states, etc., etc. But the task before Mountbatten, Nehru, Patel, and VP Menon was to try and get all those states that were going to be within the borders of post-partition India to accede to India. Okay, they were, and they had 3 weeks. Imagine 3 weeks to do it. On the 25th of July, Mountbatten addresses the Chamber of Princes and says, "You sign on the dotted line, or your days are numbered. Your subjects will rise up against you. You won't survive." And they were able to do it. There was Patel later, I think it was 1949, described it as a bloodless revolution to get all these states to accede and then to integrate into India. What my book shows is that it was anything but bloodless. There was, of course, what happened when the Indian Army invaded Hyderabad in order to, in the police action, because Hyderabad had wanted to go alone. See, all these states under the India Act had the option of either remaining independent, joining India, or joining Pakistan. And you imagine if they all exercised that right that was enshrined in law, the mess you would have had. You would have had, this balkanized India, and literally decades of nationalist struggle would have just I mean, how do you build a nation when you've got these fragmented principalities? Some well run, well administered, Mysore, Baroda, Travancore, etc., like that. But a lot of them were just still living in the medieval days. I mean, these rulers did not know how to administer their states. Some of them were, the old stereotypes again of the sort of lecherous ruler who would spend his, holidays in Europe playing polo and partying. Gosh, it sounds like Jai Singh, Sawai Man Singh, which is exactly what he did. But although he was a smart guy, I mean, Jaipur was one of the better ruled states. So that's in a nutshell. That's what the book is about. How these states, which occupied 2/3 of India's land, 2/5 of India's landmass, and these princes ruled over 1/3 of the population. How India became a united country out of this mess.
Fascinating. And it is those questions of alternative histories. What if there was something else that would have happened? But it is exactly that John answers in this book and in many of his other books. And if you ever pick up The Shortest History of India and you say, John, this is missing, then John will tell you, well, why don't you pick up this book? Because I've gone into the details of it. So you say, John, you've written about royalty, but now what about royalty dethroned? So he'll pick up his another book and say, well, I've also written about that. So thank you, John, for writing and for giving us food for thought. This was absolutely amazing. And thank you to all of you for tuning into this episode of Jaipur Bites. Thank you.